I'm glad my wife was here to hear that introduction. I've been telling her those things. And hey, it's good to be back here again. I don't know, it's been 3 or 4 years ago since I was back here. And every time I come back to this campus, I have a profound sense of how old I really am. Man, you guys are young. I'll tell you what, you make me covet the slim waist and the full head of hair, no gray, man. You guys look good, I'll tell you. Hey, I am, the only thing you really need to know about me, 2 things I want to tell you is I'm Native American and I am a Christian. And that has been a struggle. It's not as easy as it sounds to blend those 2 in my life. I'm an old man, I'll confess that, okay? I grew up in the era when Western movies were still very big. And as I was growing up, we'd go to the theater on Saturdays, and usually we called them cowboy and Indians. That's what we called them back in those days, okay? And the cowboys were the heroes, okay? And the Indians usually got beat. But being Native American, I kept pulling for the underdogs all the time. And every week I would go, and the plots were pretty much the same thing. If you know these old Western movies, okay, here's this wagon train, and they're headed out west, and they got a bunch of guys, but they're attacked by these band of Indians will attack. And so they always circle the wagons, and for some reason, I don't know why, Indians didn't write these movies, okay, but for some reason, the Indians would ride around the wagon train going, woo, 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 and they'd, there'd be 3 people left in the wagon train. John Wayne, and usually a female like Maureen O'Hara, you probably know who that is, but Maureen O'Hara, and there was a Gabby Hayes kind of a character, okay, a comedic sidekick. There'd be 3 of them left, and I'm watching, I'm thinking, we're going to win this time, okay, we got them. And for some reason, the Indians would just circle the wagon trains, and John Wayne would pick them off one by one. And every week, I'd go home disappointed because the Indians lost. And then a few years later, I was sitting there in the movie theater. I don't know if you ever had a football team that just wasn't any good, and you go to the games anyway, but you don't expect much. Well, I go to the movies, and I don't really expect we're going to win, okay? But I go anyway. But this one day, man, I put my popcorn down and I sat up straight, And John Wayne got killed. He did. It was a movie called The Alamo, okay? Now, it wasn't the Native Americans, it was the Mexicans, okay? And they attacked the Alamo and John Wayne got his. But, man, I don't know if there's any Hispanics here, but I love you, brothers. I'll tell you what, you're not. Okay. Thank you, okay? I say that to you. I say that to you to say this, okay? I grew up in an area where there was a lot of negative stereotypes about Native Americans. Truly, there really was. And I struggled with that growing up because there were so many negative stereotypes about us. Common misconceptions and things people would say about us. Actually, there were, and I hate to say this, but it's true. There were times in my young life when I was almost embarrassed to be Indian, Native American, because of so much of the negativity that was associated with our people and the things that people would say. But as I grew and as I studied, and I began to understand our history, I developed a sense of pride knowing who our people were. Time doesn't permit me to tell you all the accomplishments that Native people had even when the Europeans came. But as I began to study, I began to realize that our civilization was not as backward as it was portrayed. And we had some good thinkers and some good people and people who understood the world. And so I began to appreciate my cultural heritage. My father was raised in tribal religion. He became a Christian, raised me. I was raised in a Christian home, and so I grew up in church. But the church I grew in, we weren't allowed to be Native American. Now, again, time doesn't permit me, but there was, in history, there was a thing called boarding schools and reservations, and what happened, the policy of the United States government was something called Americanization. And Americanization was the idea that in order to Christianize the Indian, we had to Anglicize the Indian. And so they put us in boarding school, stripped us of our culture. My dad grew up, and in the boarding school was punished whenever he spoke his tribal tongue, because they were trying to take that away so that we wouldn't hang on to the Indianness of our culture. And that philosophy bled over into the church. And when the Christian missionaries, and God bless them, people who love the Lord, I know they did, and they brought us the gospel, and I wouldn't be a Christian if we're not for the Anglo missionaries. So what I'm about to say is I appreciate them. But the problem was there was a still understanding that we had to be like the dominant society if we're going to make it, and we had to give up being Indians. And so the church the Christian church, the Baptist church that I grew up in, we weren't allowed to go to powwows. We weren't, allowed to use the drum in church. We couldn't celebrate, worship God in the context of our culture. And so we grew up basically being Native Americans, but looking like Anglo people in our churches. But nonetheless, I was raised a Christian, and I wanted to be a good Christian. I went to college and joined the Native American Club in college. And there I met some of my brothers who were not Christians. And it was difficult because I had a crisis of faith at that point, because they called me an apple Indian. And what apple? You're red on the outside, but you're white on the inside. And that's what they called me because I was a Christian. And they told me that's a white man's religion. And so there was a period of time when I really struggled with my faith. There was a period of time when actually I because of what I read about the way that our people were treated, and I'm just being honest with you here, please don't judge me, but there was a period of time when I did not like Anglo people. I just didn't. I was very bitter about what went on, but yet at the same time, I couldn't get away from my Christian background and my Christian upbringing. And so, to make a long story short, I really struggled with who I am, because I wasn't comfortable being totally a Christian the way I was raised, because then I was turning my back on my Native American heritage, but I wasn't ready to embrace Native American religion at the expense of Christianity. And so I grew up just divided and not knowing who I was, not having a sense of identity of who I am as a Native American. And so eventually, and that's another story I could tell you, but eventually what happened to me, I was stationed in the Army down at Fort Hood, Texas, and I just got tired living the way that I was, living in bitterness, wallowing in self-defeat. And I just made a decision that the happiest I was growing up in that little Indian Baptist church. We look like Anglos, but I was happy growing up at that little Indian Baptist church back in Oklahoma. And I made a decision that Jesus is the way, the truth, and the life, and no one comes to the Father except through him. And that began a change in my life in which I began to want to help my fellow Native Americans. You need to understand 90% of my people, 90% of Native Americans in the United States and Canada are not Christians today. And they reject Jesus Christ. One of the reasons they reject Christianity, one of our Native leaders said, it's been a number of years now, but he said, of all the enemies that we've had, he said Christianity has been our greatest enemy. And he said the reason is because wherever Christians go, they commit cultural genocide. And he was referring to the fact that the Christianity I grew up in, I wasn't allowed to be Native American. And yet I knew that there was something wrong with that. And so I want to share two scriptures with you, and these are scriptures that have impacted my life, and they have spoken to me in a very special way. The first one is in the book of Revelation, chapter 5, and verse 9. Talking about the Lamb around the throne, it says, "And they sang a new song, saying, 'You are worthy to take the scroll to open the seals, for you were slain, and you have redeemed us to God by your blood. And here's what I like, out of every tribe, every tongue, and people, and nation, and have made us kings and priests to our God, and we shall reign on the earth.'" And so when I read that, here's what I see. I look and I see 90% of our people are rejecting Christianity today, and it breaks my heart because we're hurting in so many ways. And one of the things, and I wish I had time to tell you all the issues, but one of the things, suicide rate is one of the highest among my people. And the tragedy is, it's the highest among the youth and the children. And we actually have children that are taking their lives. I was recently up in Canada, and where a young child had just taken their life, and I was talking to some of the people there, and the young people, the youth, they have a saying about that, and they say, well, he cried out. And what they mean by that is he's cried and he's cried and he's cried. He couldn't cry no more, and the only hope he had was to end it all. And so he cried out, and he cried himself out. And that's the despair that I see in a lot of places because of the hardship and of the difficulties, and sometimes just the internal struggle that I myself had to face trying to live in two worlds, even today. Here's the thing you need to understand about Native Americans. Let's pick, if a Chinese person came to America, immigrated here, 4 generations, they don't speak Chinese, they're pretty much anglicized, but there's always a China where the culture is being maintained, and the Chinese culture will always be maintained. When Americans become anglicized, when Americans lose their language and lose their culture, there is no place where it's being maintained. And so when it's lost forever. And I'm living in the generation where we will cease to exist. After 500 years, we will cease to exist as culturally Native Americans. There are 21 people that speak the Sac and Fox language indigenously in my tribe. They're all old, and perhaps within my lifetime, but very soon they're going to be gone, and our language will be gone. I'm watching the demise of our people because of that. And there's always an ache in my heart because I'm proud of who I am, and I'm proud of my people, and there's no reason that we have to go. And so, but my hope as I read that scripture is that one day, every tribe, every tongue, every people will be there. I believe around the throne there's going to come a time when Native Americans will be there, and we'll gather with every other tribe in the world, and we'll be there, and we'll praise God. And that's my hope for the future. And that's why I like that verse. But you know what? The question that always haunts my life is, but what about now? Does knowing Jesus Christ as being a Christian, does that make any difference in the world now? Well, the other one comes from the model prayer in Matthew chapter 6. And Jesus is teaching how to pray. But he says something that really resonates well with me, okay? And he says, in this manner pray. And then he says, our Father in heaven, hallowed be your name. Then in verse 10 he says, your kingdom come, your will be done on earth as it is in heaven. And the idea when Jesus taught us to pray, your kingdom come, your will be done, that has special meaning for me. Craig Blomberg says that in this particular passage, he says this expresses the desire, acknowledgement that God's reign and the accomplishment of his purposes will take place on this earth. Okay? Here's the thing. I believe when Jesus came, I believe he came and he established his kingdom now. And I believe that when John sent that word and said, are you the one or do we expect another? And Jesus said, the blind receive their sight, the lame walk, the dead are raised up, the poor have the gospel preached to him. He was talking about the fact that when the kingdom of God is here, and it's here right now, that the evil of this world is done away with. And that we can overcome the injustice, we can overcome the hurt, we can overcome, you know why? Because the kingdom is established now. It's a future hope, but it's also a present reality. And where the kingdom reigns, we can make a difference in this world. And I believe that's true with Native Americans. I believe wherever the kingdom reigns that we can impact the world for Jesus Christ. And so I have this hope, okay? And here's what I believe. Now, I honestly believe, my personal opinion, that we're living in a time when our society is just messed up, okay? And we seem to put, yesterday I voted, okay? We need to be good citizens. But even as I voted, my hope is not in the Republicans. My hope is not in the Democrats. My hope is not in any person here upon this earth. Even as I voted yesterday, my hope is in Jesus Christ, that his kingdom will come, and that what we'll see, and I believe, you know, my opinion, but I believe we're dealing with a lot of things. There's a lot of bitterness. There's a lot of hatred in this world. There's terrorism. Ever since 9/11, we live in fear of terrorism. But I also believe that there is a subtle racism that exists in this country that we still deal with and we still can't overcome. And I look at the hopelessness, I look at the suicide, and I see what's going on. And as much as I go around preaching and try to share the gospel of Jesus Christ, still 90% of my people have rejected Jesus Christ because of the package that it comes in. And I'm old, man, I'll admit it. And I come down to the place, I'm not retiring, I'm not resigning, but I do, I'm smart enough to know that I've got more years behind me than I got in front of me. And I'm desperate because I don't want to leave this world knowing that my people have not yet found Jesus Christ. And you know, sometimes I get discouraged and I wonder, is there any hope? And when I do, I pray, God, may your kingdom come and may your will be done here just as it is in heaven. And I believe that because Jesus came, I believe we have the power to change the world. I believe we have the power to change society. Again, slavery, back in the days of slavery, it was a terrible thing. One of the most inhumane things man has done to man was the slave trade. But yet there was a man, and you know the story, William Wilberforce. God became a Christian. God touched his heart. And not him alone, but because of his efforts, slavery was abolished in England. Segregation was big when I grew up. I remember going to segregated water fountains. But I remember a man by the name of Martin Luther King Jr., who wrote a letter from the Birmingham jail, and he wrote it to the Southern clergy, to the pastors. And I remember Southern pastors got up and stood in their pulpits and said, black people ought to be able to come to our churches. Now, a lot of them got fired, a lot of them lost jobs, a lot of them got punished, but they stood up, and it wasn't long until segregation has been abolished. And what I'm saying to you is, when I look back and I see the great social problems and the things that we've had to deal with in history, it has been the church that has made the biggest impact in society. And I don't give up that where God's kingdom is, we are salt and we are light and we can make a better world. And so I believe that there is going to be a great spiritual awakening in America. I believe everywhere I go, I say that. I'm on record everywhere I go saying that. And listen to me. I believe there's going to be a great spiritual awakening in America, and I believe it's going to be led by the Native Americans, because I believe they're going to found Christ and they're going to raise up. Billy Graham said the Native Americans are a sleeping giant. Henry Blackaby said Native Americans will lead the next great spiritual awakening in America. That is my hope. And when I say hope, I'm talking about what the Bible means by hope. That is my confident expectation. I believe that with all of my heart. I really do. Back in the days of apartheid in South Africa, and the blacks were in subjection to they lived in subjection, and in their own country, and I think it was in an interview with David Frost. He was interviewing Bishop Desmond Tutu, and he said. Bishop Tutu, he said, you've been at this for so long. You've been working for the liberation of your people. And yet, it doesn't seem that it's done any good. Blacks are still imprisoned and still second-class citizens in our own country. Don't you ever just get discouraged? Don't you ever want to give up? And Bishop Tutu said, sir, I am a Christian. And because I'm a Christian, I am a prisoner of hope. And I want to say to you today, I don't care what the world looks like today. I believe that where the kingdom touches the world that we live in, it becomes salt and it becomes light to that world. And I believe that we are the only hope. We are the only hope. And I want you not to trust in political power. I want you to vote. I want you to be good citizens. I want you not to trust in talent and ability. We live in an age of the celebrity pastor. We live in the age of the talented musician. There's nothing wrong with elegance and eloquence. There's nothing wrong with talent. But you see, David was just a shepherd boy, and God used him. Gideon was the least in all his tribe, and God used him. The 12 that followed Jesus, they were just uneducated, common, ordinary working people, and God used them to change the world. We can't all be president of the United States. We can't all get elected to Congress. But wherever God's people are, we can change the world. And what I challenge you is don't ever lose that hope. We read in Romans 5 about the suffering that produces patience. But the patience ultimately results in what? Hope. We sang about hope a while ago. The one thing that ought to characterize my life and the one thing that ought to characterize your life, regardless of what the score is today, regardless of what the circumstances are in the world today, regardless how dark the night seems, listen, the light will shine. The morning will come. And because we're here, the church shall be victorious. I believe that because I'm held captive by hope. Thank you.